My name is George, and my wife's name is Dorothy. We've been married for almost 32 years. I don't know if we will live to see the 33rd anniversary. I just found out that my Dorothy cheated on me. Not just once, not even for 6 months, but for 28 years. My life has now been completely turned upside down. Where should I go next? I'm over 50, I've been married for 32 years, and we have 3 grown children. More precisely, 2 are already adults with their own families. And Dottie, we call her Dot, our youngest, just turned 18 and just started college. Let me step back 32 years and give you some background. Dorothy is originally from Michigan and moved here to Ohio to attend college. I, on the other hand, trained to be a welder. We met at a party. Dorothy just received a breakup letter. I don't know what it's called. When a guy gets a John's letter, she was very depressed. This guy, Paul, whom she thought was the love of her life, left her when she started school in Ohio. She was devastated and continued to walk around in a fog until her friend Dixie told her she needed a distraction. They went to a party where I just happened to be. As soon as I saw her, I immediately fell in love with her. She was a small, frail girl, only 5 feet tall, weighing maybe 110 pounds. She had dark brown hair and the cutest dimples you could imagine. They say that I am quite a cheerful person. I always joke and am the life of the party. I started talking to Dorothy, and within 6 months we were married. I think I managed to take it on the rebound. Our life was good. I have nothing to compare it to. Our marriage was quite ordinary. No big surprises, no second or third husbands or wives. Just a normal everyday marriage for the last 32 years. We went on family vacations, went bowling, golfed, and went to our kids' sporting events and performances. We were ordinary parents who loved our children and practically lived for them. Dorothy and I both work. She is a teacher and I am a welder. Money was never a big problem, but sometimes it was a little tight. We own our house and our 2 vehicles, her car and my truck, are paid off. Our sex life was good. When we were younger, we did this 3 to 4 times a week. After George Jr. was born, we were lucky if it happened twice a week. 5 years later, after Mike was born, I was lucky if I could achieve intimacy even once a week. I understood this. A working woman with 2 small children, such a life leaves an imprint. I helped a lot, but Dorothy probably didn't notice. And then when Dot was born, Mike was already 5 years old. She became the love of my life. She could always get her way if she just asked, and she knew it. With children, we always had love and abundance. There was practically nothing we wouldn't do for them. We raised them with love. They grew up well-mannered, smart, and honest. We couldn't wish for better children. The only thing that has suffered over the years is probably our sex life. By this point, our intimacy occurred no more than twice a month, if we were lucky. We haven't tried anything new in sex. Several times she told me that sex does not play a big role in her life. This is quite a disappointment for a man, so I didn't insist. When I tried, she had sex with me, but it was more of a mechanical action, little kissing and hugging. Don't think that I am such a wonderful husband who has never cheated on his wife. I had sexual relations on the side. I often went to bars after work. If a woman flirted with me, I took advantage of it. I liked weird sex, especially when there was none at home. I didn't have affairs, but I had a lot of one-off meetings. This has been going on for 15 years. If I didn't get it at home, I wasn't going to stay without it. Looking back, I realized that our marriage was not based on strong love between us after the first few years. After George Jr. was born, our marriage felt more like a relationship with respect without much worry. I don't remember Dorothy ever saying, "I love you" to me. I think it was mostly a marriage of convenience, except where the children were concerned. Now about the present tense. I was in the garage when the phone rang, and Dorothy and I answered at the same time. It was Dixie and I decided to listen for a few seconds and then make a joke like, "Watch what you're saying. I'm here too." When I heard her ask Dorothy if she was ready to go to the homecoming, I just hung up thinking she would tell me about it later. When I entered the house, she was still talking to Dixie. After she hung up, I asked what they were talking about, and she said they were planning to go to their 35th reunion. I looked at her and said, "You didn't even mention it or ask if I wanted to go with you." "George, in 35 years, you've never gone with me. "Why should I think you'd want to go now?" She answered, "I'll call Dixie and tell her you'll take me." "Wait," I replied. "I don't want to go to some stupid old homecoming. I haven't even been to my own. I just thought it would be nice if you told me about it. That's all." Something was wrong. I didn't know what. I had no reason not to trust Dorothy. None at all. But still, I installed wiretapping on my phone. I used it to record people's comments when I took welding jobs. I always warned them that they would be recorded. This solved a lot of problems, if there were disagreements about the work. The recording was activated by voice. When the conversation ended, the recording stopped. The next day I listened to the recording. Dorothy called Dixie again and apologized for hanging up so abruptly the day before. She said she was worried that I would suddenly want to go to my high school reunion. It would ruin everything after all her preparations. What preparations? With whom? I thought. When she returned home, I said I wanted to talk to her. She looked at me in surprise and asked, "About what?" "I wanted to talk about your homecoming. Maybe this year I'll go with you. Who even goes to these meetings in all these 35 years? She looked a little nervous, but started talking. Well, let's think about it. Now, about 30 classmates gather at meetings. Some come with their spouses, others come alone, some bring their families to the buffet dinner, and then take the kids home and back for the dance. Singles and divorced people bring friends, but you are only allowed to bring one friend. In total, up to 100 people sometimes gather for such events. What a terrible word, event, I thought. When will this meeting take place? I asked. October 8th, the first Saturday in October. She replied, "Tell me if you decide to go so I can change my reservation. I'll let you know for sure by the end of next week." Would I know anyone there other than Dixie and her husband Joe? I asked. Dorothy thought for a moment and replied, "I don't think you've ever met any of my classmates, so most likely you don't know anyone." "And Paul, your ex-boyfriend, didn't he go to the same school as you?" She got nervous and said, "Yes, he is married. He has a family, just like us." "Why are you pestering me with these stupid questions about old meetings and old friends? What came over you? Do you want me to stay home to make you feel safer?" "Sorry, honey, it's just an old guy getting nosy. I'll let you know as soon as I can about the meeting," I replied. I contacted a private detective with whom I had worked before. He checked the construction sites I was working on to get an idea of what I would be up against. But this time the task was different. "Jones's Investments. How can I help you?" The secretary's voice rang out. "Jim, please," I replied. "This is George Manning." "Just a minute," she said, calling Jim. "Hi, George. Long time no see. What can I do for you?" "Well, Jim, I have a suspicion that haunts me. I need a private investigator to check something to put my soul at ease. This must be done as quickly as possible, very quietly, and without suspicion." "Will it do?" I asked. "Give me some facts and I'll tell you if I can help," Jim replied. "The fact is that I have suspicions that my wife is cheating on me. I don't have proof, but I have this feeling. She's going to a high school reunion and doesn't want me to go. She has been going there every 5 years for the past 30 years. I've never gone and didn't suspect anything wrong before. I hope your investigation turns out to be in vain. The meeting takes place in Michigan and almost always in the same place. The location may have changed several times. What do you think, Jim?" I asked again. "Well, George, it's going to cost a fortune to travel, but I can find out everything I need by Friday. This is basically a record check. We need to go back through the dates and see if anything comes up. I hope we can put your mind at ease." Jim replied, "Thanks, Jim. We'll talk on Friday," I said. I gave him all the information that could help in the investigation and went back to work. I had no idea why I was so worried. I lived a completely decent life without serious problems. It was just one of those gut feelings, and I needed to get rid of all the questions I had. Maybe I'm becoming insecure with age. I'm already over 50. I hope nothing turns out to be true, but for some reason, I knew it wasn't. Jim called me on Friday. "George, I've gotten a few people involved in this case, and I've come across something that doesn't add up." First, I spoke to the reunion committee and introduced myself as a government official, explaining that I needed to look at their alumni reunion records for the last 30 years. I explained that this was part of the security clearance test and that I could not reveal any information to them. He said that this was strictly classified, and if anyone started spreading rumors, they could be prosecuted. The more you tell people, the more information they provide. This is simply incredible. I showed them the fake IDs, and they gave me all the information for 30 years. Here's what I learned. Your wife attended all but 6 meetings. Her name appears in the logbooks for all 6 events. The strange thing begins with the gap. The fact that at the first 2 meetings, she had a room booked. But for the last 4, her name was not among those booked. We assume she was living with someone else. There's no way to know who exactly from the names you gave. Her friend Dixie and her husband Joe also attended all 6 meetings and booked a room for 2. So your wife didn't live with them. The only other name you gave was Paul Simon. He also attended all 6 meetings. At the first 2 meetings, he booked a room for 1 person, and at the last 4, he was billed as Mr. and Mrs. Paul Simon. We have assumed that his wife was with him at the last 4 reunions, but her name is nowhere listed as classmates or guests. George, maybe he should find out if his wife was really there. I can't do more without giving myself away, and you didn't want that. Well, that's all I have for now. If you need anything, just call. I'm always in touch. I thanked Jim for his work and began to think about what he had told me. Things were not going very well. There was no real evidence yet, but my inner voice kept telling me the truth. When I returned home, Dorothy was not yet there, and I decided to listen to the recordings from the listening device. Dorothy called Dixie again and said I could still go to the meeting, and she didn't know what to do. Dixie said, "Just call Paul, he'll understand." I was stunned the truth began to emerge. It turned out that Dorothy was going to meet Paul. Her friend Dixie may have been aware or even involved, and then the first of 2 bombs sounded. Dorothy began to cry and said, "This is my special time with Paul. I don't want to lose him. I love him so much and always have." Dixie replied, "Calm down, Dorothy, you're losing yourself." "My delight, God, girl, you gave birth to children from him. What more do you want?" Dorothy replied, "I know I'm just upset. Forgive me, I'll call you later," and hung up. What did she just say? I played the recording over and over again. Dorothy never denied it on tape. Are my children not mine? I raised them for 32 years, and now I find out that they are not mine? No, this can't be true. Maybe I misunderstood the message. No, this couldn't be happening. How could I not notice this after 32 years? I couldn't face her now. I would kill her. I left her a note saying that I needed to go to work in another city and would return tomorrow. I also told her that I had important work to do on the day of her homecoming and that I would not be able to go. My life just completely fell apart. I needed proof about the children. It was too much for me. I remembered when the kids were younger, Dorothy took them to the state fair. There was a special DNA laboratory for children where DNA analysis could be done for a certain amount. I remember that the authorities actively promoted this program for identification purposes. Dorothy did DNA testing for our children. I remember Dot coming home screaming, "Daddy, Daddy, guess what? George and Mike are my brothers. They took our blood and we are all related." Dorothy then told me that it was a school and state DNA identification program. I remember looking at Dot and starting to laugh, saying, "That's good. Honey for all of us." But now I was no longer so sure. I remembered that the test results were kept in a safe. I needed to get copies when I got home. I decided to make an appointment with the doctor to check a few things. I went to one of those urgent care clinics, and they saw me right away. I told the doctor that I needed a DNA test to see if I should have a vasectomy. I didn't want to do it if it wasn't necessary. I also asked if they could do a DNA test while I was here. I didn't actually intend to have a vasectomy. I just came up with it as a way to check the number. The doctor took the necessary samples but said that the results would only be ready in a week. I replied that this was normal and that I would use condoms for now. We both laughed. I went through this week as if on autopilot expecting results, but I already knew the truth. I decided to start planning my revenge. I had a month to prepare everything. Our 33rd wedding anniversary was 2 days after our high school reunion. I decided to arrange a surprise for everyone. A lot of people will get hurt, but at least the truth will come out. I remembered that Dorothy said that the buffet was a great place to bring your family, so I decided to invite all 3 of our children to this surprise. First, I called George Jr., our eldest son who is 29 and has 3 children. I told him about the high school reunion his mom was going to and told her I couldn't go, but I thought I'd like to surprise her for our anniversary. Come with her family, children, and grandchildren. She would never have expected this from me. I was willing to pay for him and his family's accommodation for one night. I thought we didn't have to go until Saturday evening and we could spend Sunday together as a family. He was excited about the idea of throwing a surprise for his mom. He said he would discuss it with his wife and contact me, but he didn't see it as a problem. Then I called Mike. He's 24, recently married, and has a 6-month-old baby. I told him the same story, and he also said that he would discuss it with his wife, but did not see a problem with it. And finally, I called my youngest daughter, Dot, who is now 18. She just started college in Michigan a month ago. I told her the same story. I told the boys, and she was delighted. She said, "Mom will be delighted. I can't wait. I don't need to make a reservation, Dad. My hostel is only 5 miles from the Ramada Inn. I can spend the evening with you and then go back to the dorm and come back the next day. It's not worth spending money on a room." I told all 3 of them not to hint or mention anything to the mother under any circumstances, otherwise our plan would fail. God, what wonderful children I have. But why aren't they mine? I think after the meeting I will find out if they want to remain my children. Once I had calmed down a bit, I was able to meet Dorothy. It was then that I began to look at our life differently. I realized that there was really no love. It was simply a marriage of convenience. She lived her life, and I lived mine. It was not difficult for me to behave as usual. In fact, I began to behave like a loving husband. I wanted to make her think. I told her to dress up, and I'll take her to dinner. I complimented her. She really looked good. We had a wonderful dinner, and I was as nice as possible to her. I even opened the car door for her. She looked at me and asked, "George, what's gotten into you?" I simply told her that I wanted to be a loving husband and that I wanted the rest of my years to be good. I don't think she believed me, but she didn't ask questions. I made sure she had enough wine. I thought I could get intimate if she was drunk enough. When we got home, she was a little tipsy. I helped her undress and decided to try to please her. I couldn't believe it. She just spread her legs and let me do it. We didn't do this for years, and then I took her and gave it my all. It was a kind of revenge sex. I poured everything I could into her, and she began to be delighted. I continued to wonder who she might be fantasizing about when she started to get aroused. Damn, this is really good, I thought. We'll have to do this a couple of more times before she meets Paul. Over the next few days, there were no new recordings on the telephone wiretap. In fact, she didn't say anything to Dixie about our wild sex, and that actually disappointed me a little. She probably didn't want Dixie to know that she cheated on Paul by sleeping with her husband. I suggested to Dorothy that we go somewhere else on Saturday night. Why not invite Dixie and Joe? We could all have dinner together and maybe even dance a little. This way, she can practice dancing before her graduation. The next day, I heard a new message on the device. She was talking to Dixie again. "Hi, Dixie," Dorothy said. "I called to tell you that..." George was acting strange. What kind of strange things, Dixie asked. Well, he started acting very affectionate, saying nice things, treating me like gold. This doesn't look like him at all. "Do you think he suspects something?" "Are you kidding me?" Dixie said. "You've been cheating on your husband for 32 years. You have 3 children from your ex-lover, and you think that he suspects something and will now treat you like gold for this." "You're probably right," Dorothy replied. "This doesn't sound like revenge, does it? Anyway, George wanted me to ask if you and Joe would like to come with us to dinner and dancing on Saturday." "Sounds good," said Dixie, "but it doesn't sound like George at all. Maybe he finally feels guilty for all the times he cheated on you. It's a little late for repentance, isn't it? Have you already written him a divorce letter?" "I started it, but I don't want to give it away until I leave for a meeting." "Do you think you can hold off Joe for the evening? I wouldn't want him to let it slip. He's Paul's best friend after all." "Joe will be fine," Dixie replied. "He will be glad when this story of betrayal finally ends. Hell, maybe you can sleep with your husband one last time." "I won't tell Paul," she laughed. This completely confirmed my suspicions. Now I know everything. All I had to do was wait for the test results, and then everything would become completely clear. It was time for Saturday night, and Dorothy, and I got dressed up for our double date with her friends Dixie and Joe. I called a taxi. I figured we'd all be too drunk to drive after the evening, maybe even rent a number if necessary. We picked up Dixie and Joe, and they were surprised to see a taxi. I just told them that this way we would be able to drink as much as we wanted without having to worry about travel. Joe looked at me and said, "I've never seen you like this, George." "Just thought we should live a little before it's too late," I replied. "Actually, this evening is entirely at my expense. I was paid a bonus for the job I took on Dorothy's homecoming day. I couldn't refuse, and since I can't go to the meeting, we'll have some fun today." Everyone was a little surprised. Even Dorothy said nothing. I think she decided that since we were getting divorced soon, there was no point in objecting to me crying. I looked at Joe and said, "Damn, what beautiful ladies we have today." They both wore similar dresses that accentuated their figures. The dresses were mid-thigh length and the legs looked great. Of course they smiled at my comment. You need to understand that from that moment my life went into revenge mode. I had no more regrets other than the fact that the children were not mine, but it was like I invited two women to the evening. I was just going to enjoy the moment. We stopped at a great restaurant and bar at the Holiday Inn. We ordered drinks before dinner, everyone wanted cocktails, and I, as usual, took a beer. After the first round, I went to get the next drink myself and ordered doubles for everyone. I wanted these three to be drunk by the end of the evening. I only drank beer, and being an experienced beer drinker, I knew how much I could handle. As we ate, I noticed that everyone began to relax. We started laughing and chatting. We were having a really good time. I could see that they had all let go of their guard and were just enjoying the evening. After dinner, we all went to a bar where there was music playing and we could dance. I went and got more drinks. The girls were on the verge of fun and laughed at almost every word. Dorothy asked me, "Are you trying to get me drunk?" I looked at her and said, "Yes, and Dixie too, and then Joe and I will make love to you." Everyone laughed, but I was serious. I asked Dorothy to dance. She stood up and we moved to the dance floor. Joe and Dixie followed us. We did a couple of slow dances, and Dorothy asked to sit down because she was starting to feel dizzy. While she sat, she continued to drink. Joe and Dixie also soon returned to the table. I asked Joe if he would mind if I danced with Dixie. He said, "Of course not. I can't keep up with her." Dixie and I went out onto the dance floor and moved a little further away so that we could not be seen from our table. Dixie was already pretty drunk, so I just hugged her and started swaying her to the music. She said she had never seen me like this. I asked her, "Is this good or bad?" She looked at me and replied, "Okay, very good. I like you like that. I always liked it when women got drunk and lost their inhibitions." And this is exactly what happened to Dixie. I grabbed her buttocks with both hands and pulled her towards me. She looked at me, but didn't move. Away. I looked her in the eyes and asked, "Are you okay?" She simply replied, "Just don't let Joe notice." Okay? After a couple of dances, we all returned to the table and continued chatting and telling funny stories about each other. These were unimportant stories, just funny jokes. After an hour and a half, the girls were practically passed out. Joe was also pretty drunk, but he could still walk. I told everyone that I got a room with 2 large beds. Nobody objected. They all needed rest. We headed to the room, and the girls said they didn't have night clothes. I told them we were all adults and friends, so they could sleep in their underwear. I suggested that they go to the bathroom first, while Joe and I waited in the hallway. While we waited, Joe said he had a great evening and thanked me. He even noted that in his opinion, I turned out to be a good guy. It was clear that he felt uneasy about the impending divorce. I told him it wasn't a problem, but added that the night wasn't over yet. After that, we entered the room. The girls were already lying in bed, dressed only in bras and panties. They were clearly on the verge of passing out. The only light came from the bathroom, and the room was quite dark. I stripped my clothes down to my underwear, and Joe did the same. I sat on the edge of my bed and pulled the blanket off Dorothy. She slept lying on her back. Joe just looked at us in bewilderment. I reached over and took off her bra. He continued to look, clearly not believing his eyes. His eyes darted from his wife to the next bed to Dorothy. I asked, "Have you ever seen Dorothy's breasts?" He was too drunk to speak, clearly and simply shook his head. I told him, "Well, then you have an opportunity." He came closer and sat on the edge of the bed next to Dorothy. I invited him to touch it, saying that he would bet he'd never have such an opportunity again. He looked back at the bed where his wife was lying, saw that she was sleeping, and began to rub Dorothy's breasts. Dorothy slowly began to become excited, although she was still semi-conscious. Then I carefully removed her panties. A drunk man simply could not miss such a spectacle. He couldn't resist, and his hand reached down to explore her. I looked at him and asked, "Have you ever wanted to have sex with her?" Joe, still focused on what was happening, replied a lot of times, but she was Dixie's friend. I told him he could do it right now. This is his only chance. He didn't need to be told twice. He stood up, pulled down his boxers, and stood between Dorothy's legs. While he was doing this, I went to Dixie's bed, carefully removed the blanket from her, and began to unclasp her bra. Joe noticed this and wanted to say something, but didn't dare because he was busy having sex with my wife. I continued to remove Dixie's underwear and ended up between her legs. Joe, noticing that I was having sex with his wife, seemed to gain courage and began to move more vigorously. He was so engrossed in his act that he probably didn't even realize that this was some kind of... When I finished with Dixie, she opened her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, George. It was wonderful." I grinned and said, "You're welcome, Dixie. If you want to repeat it, I'll soon be lonely." Her eyes widened, and there was a look of understanding that I knew about the divorce she was talking about with Dorothy. I smiled at her, then stood up and covered her with the blanket. At that moment, Joe finished with Dorothy and lay down next to her without saying a word. I lay down next to Dorothy and fell into a deep sleep. In the morning, I woke up first, probably because I only drank beer the night before. I took a shower and went down to the restaurant to have a cup of coffee. About half an hour later, I called the room, and Dorothy answered, "Good morning, dear." "How is everyone doing?" I asked. Dorothy asked, "Where are you, George?" I replied. "Calm down, Dorothy. I'm just in a restaurant drinking coffee. You were all fast asleep, and I didn't want to wake anyone up, so I took a shower and left. Do you want me to get you some coffee, or do you want to come down here?" She replied, "We'll be down in a few minutes." I would give a lot to be a fly on the wall when they all woke up. Joe saw me having sex with his wife, but he couldn't say anything because he was having sex with mine. Dixie knew I knew about the divorce, but she couldn't tell Dorothy because I was having sex with her when I told her. God, how I love it when everything goes according to plan. They all went downstairs to the restaurant, and we ordered breakfast. It was noticeable that everyone was slightly tense, of course, except for me. The week passed quietly as I listened to the conversations between Dorothy and Dixie. They talked a little about our double date. Dorothy admitted that I probably undressed her and then had violent sex with her. I then heard her say that she noticed her underwear was missing. The next morning, she asked if Joe had sex with Dixie. Dixie responded that she was a complete mess too, and Joe probably also did his thing while she was unconscious. Now before me appeared two friends who were lying to each other. Dixie also asked if Dorothy had finished her divorce letter. Dorothy replied that she was finished and that it was hidden in her underwear drawer. She planned to leave it on the table Thursday night when she left for her homecoming. When Dorothy left for work, I looked in her underwear drawer and found my goodbye letter. Here's what it said. Dorothy to George. "Dear George, you better grab yourself a beer and sit down before reading this letter. I'm leaving you. I'll file for divorce when I get back from my high school reunion. I know this will be a complete shock to you. After 32 years of our marriage, I at least owe you a reason. When we got married, I was on an emotional high after my affair with Paul Simon. You knew about him, but you had never met him. Believe it or not, you and look a lot alike. You both have brown hair, brown eyes, are about 6 feet tall, and you both weigh about 200 pounds, or at least you did 32 years ago. That's probably why I was drawn to you. But no matter how hard I tried, it was always Paul, not you. Every time we had sex, I imagined him, not you. Then what was supposed to happen happened. I went to a high school reunion 5 years after high school and met Paul again. I called Paul and he was thrilled about it, but so were you. I didn't know what to do. Then Paul and I decided that we would keep our marriage, but we would see each other at homecomings and reminisce about old times. However, we met several times when I went to Michigan to visit my parents before they died. 5 years later, it happened again. We met, made passionate love, spent time together, and swore to keep our lives a secret. It was like a fantasy. There was even a movie about old lovers who meet every year to renew their love. That's what happened between me and Paul. Of course, when I returned home after the second meeting, we had sex again. It was one of the best times I had having sex with you, especially after dating. Maybe it was cheating, but the sex after the meetings was amazing. 9 months later, Michael was born. See where I'm going with this. Michael was also Paul's son. I know I should feel guilty, but I don't. You were a good father to the boys. You did everything a good father should do. Paul was delighted again, knowing how prolific he was. He now had 2 children with his wife and 2 with me. On the third meeting, after all the passionate love between Paul and me, we needed to tell someone. We wanted to share our joy with each other. So I told Dixie and Joe. They were stunned at first, but then said they always suspected something was going on all these years. They noticed that Paul and I always seemed so happy together. Paul was Joe's best friend after all. After Dot was born, I mentioned to Paul about having a vasectomy. He had 2 children with his wife and now 3 with me. I said, I don't want more children. Of course, as was customary when I returned home after the third meeting, we had sex again. Damn it. As you know, I took DNA tests at the state fair and all 3 children came from the same father. You truly were a wonderful father. I'm not going to tell the kids that Paul is their biological father. They love you too much and will most likely hate me. I know you cheated on me yourself for years. We got weird calls from women looking for you, and there were all those late-night trips to the bar. I can't blame you because I didn't give you what you needed as often. I know you have questions, but we won't talk much. I will try to explain why we stayed together. Paul and I started out as a fleeting romance and affair. We discovered that our true feelings were for each other, and we wanted to be together. So we finally decided to wait until our kids were grown up and then move somewhere together to spend the remaining years of our lives. Dot is now in college, and George Jr. and Mike already have their own families. I know that you won't have any problems living your life because there wasn't much love between us to begin with. Paul told his wife he wanted a divorce last year, and it has already been finalized. It's just you and me, George. We've both contributed to our assets, and my lawyer says an uncontested marriage can be dissolved in 6 months. Equal split 50-50. Just keep in mind that Paul and I met up whenever we could, even though the 200-mile distance made it difficult. This happened more than once every 5 years. We thought about this a lot. Sorry for misleading you for so long. There's nothing more to say, George. Good luck to you in the future. Best regards, Dorothy. It's time to go back to the doctor and get the results. I needed them for divorce proceedings. I walked into the doctor's office and waited for my name to be called. The receptionist said, George Manning. George Manning. I got up. Please follow me, she said. I entered the office and soon the doctor came. Good afternoon, George, said the doctor. How are you today? I just came for the results of the DNA test. I replied, well, George, you won't need a vasectomy. The doctor replied that motorcycle accident you had 15 years ago severely damaged your lower pelvic region. You will no longer be able to become a father. I don't know if this is good or bad, but you won't need a vasectomy. What about my DNA, doctor? Do you have my results? I asked. The doctor handed me a graph that had a lot of dots and lines on it. I looked at him, but honestly said, I don't know what I'm looking at. The doctor replied, you need to see another graph to explain it better. I reached into the file and pulled out Dot's DNA test, which I had taken from the safe. The doctor placed both graphs on the light panel and began to study them. Now this schedule is for a girl, he said. Do you see where all these dots and lines intersect? This means there's a 99% chance that this girl is your daughter. I couldn't hold back my tears. Joy and pride overwhelmed me. My daughter, my flesh and blood. The doctor looked at me and asked, "Is everything okay, George?" "Everything is fine, doctor," I replied. "Can you look at these other two graphs?" "Let's see," he said. "They are both boys and probably brothers. Now, let's put your chart next to them and see." The doctor looked at the graphs and continued, "Yes, you see the points and lines on all these graphs are the same. There's a 99% chance that these are your sons," the doctor concluded. "I can put all this in writing and notarize it if you want." I nodded. "Please do it. That would be great." Then I asked another question, "Doctor, what does 99% probability mean?" The doctor laughed. "That means there is only one chance in 9 million that these children are not yours. Only one person in 9 million could be their father. So those are pretty safe odds." I left the doctor's office a very happy person. After receiving the documents with the DNA results and the notarized letter, I headed home. Monday arrived, and I only had a few days until Thursday to prepare a plan. I started by looking for a good lawyer. My friend mentioned Sally Hawk, who helped him and his friend through their divorce. I made an appointment with Sally, taking with me all the DNA documents and a copy of the letter from Dorothy. Damn, Sally was a beauty, but I immediately realized that she was a person who did not stand on ceremony. She read the letter from Dorothy first, and I noticed her eyes water a little. Then she looked at the DNA results and almost laughed out loud. "Well, Mr. Manning, what do you suggest?" she asked. "First of all, please call me George if that's convenient for you. And secondly, I want to get everything I can legally," I replied. Sally began to explain. "You had a 32-year marriage, good or bad. Your wife accuses you of adultery but does not provide any evidence. On the other hand, you have this letter written in her hand where she admits to cheating for 32 years. If you file for divorce first, you can receive 65% of all assets. There will, of course, be some minor disputes, but the Ohio courts will be on your side. You could get even more if the children weren't yours, but I think what you have is much more important than money." I looked at her and nodded with a smile. Sally continued, "I will need a list of all credit accounts, savings accounts, and a rough list of assets. We will immediately freeze all credit cards registered in your name. I'm also going to freeze all savings accounts pending litigation. We will allow withdrawals of up to $100 per day with a maximum of $500 per week until all paperwork is completed. It will take about a week. I think your wife's retirement accounts should go to her and yours should go to you. Each of you earned this money. Also, any family heirlooms that are passed down must be returned to their owner." Sally added, "Are you planning to stay in your current home? If not, I suggest holding an auction and selling the house and its contents, splitting the money in the ratio of 65% to 35%. That would be the easiest thing," she said confidently. Sally looked at me and asked, "I know this is hard for you, but life goes on. I've seen this hundreds of times. Now it all comes down to money. Do you have anything to say?" I nodded and replied, "Just thanks for your help and advice. I agree with everything you suggested. I don't want to live in this big house alone. Too many memories, both good and bad. Is it possible that the divorce papers will be delivered at the reunion this Saturday along with a draft of the proposed agreement? I would also like to get a restraining order to prevent her from entering the house without my permission and taking the property." Sally replied, "It will cost a little more, but we can speed up the process. I'll have the deputy deliver the documents to the Ramada on Saturday. The injunction will take effect on Sunday. You must understand that she has the right to enter the house, but will not be able to take anything other than her personal belongings." We discussed everything, and I thanked Sally again. I started planning the last 2 days before my wife left for a meeting and disappeared from my life. I contacted my sons and daughter to make sure they were going to their high school reunion. Everyone agreed to be there. I then told them that I wanted to meet them before dinner. I had something very important that could change their mind about whether to go to dinner, but most of all, I needed their support. This was a dramatic life change for me and their mother. I told them I couldn't tell them more now, but I'll see you on Saturday at the Ramada Hotel. I mentioned to Dorothy that since she was taking Thursday and Friday off to go early to a meeting, we could go out to dinner on Wednesday night. She thought it was a good idea. I knew she just wanted to act normal and not make any waves at this stage of her game. It's Wednesday. We went to dinner and I acted like it was a date. I opened doors for her, pushed back her chair, and complimented her. She drank wine, trying not to get drunk, and I drank my regular beer. After dinner, we went to the cinema, a romantic film. Then we went home. She said she had a great evening and liked everything. When we returned home, she changed into a nightgown and went to bed. I completely undressed and lay down next to her. She looked at me and said, "Not today, George. I'm very tired." I had never been rude to Dorothy, but this night was going to be different. She's leaving me, so I had nothing to lose. She screamed, "George, stop it." I said no, but I kept squeezing. She tried to push my hand away with both hands, but she was not strong enough. She screamed again, "George, stop it. I'm not in the mood." "Well, I'm in the mood. We can do this in a good way or in a bad way. Your choice." She replied, "George, what has gotten into you? Please don't hurt me." "Dorothy, I don't intend to hurt you, but I do intend to have sex with you and do it well." I asked her again, for good or for bad. She gave in. "Okay, George, I'll play along," and sat up to take off her nightgown, leaving only her panties on. I said, "Now lie back down," and as she lay down, I gently touched her waist, pulling her closer. Her breathing became ragged as I gently stroked her thigh. We were close, and her touch responded to mine, creating a subtle tension. I caressed her, feeling how she gradually surrendered to this moment. She whispered softly, "It feels so good. Please don't stop." Her words enveloped me in warmth, and I continued, kissing her skin tenderly, feeling her body respond to every touch. Our movements were smooth and harmonious, as if we understood each other without words. I looked at her, and her eyes shone with desire and tenderness. We stopped for a moment, and I asked, "Do you want to continue?" She nodded, her breathing becoming deeper and deeper. Our bodies synchronized, and we lost ourselves in the moment, taking our time and enjoying every moment. When it was all over, we lay down next to each other, tired but happy. She smiled and said quietly, "It was incredible." She fell exhausted onto the bed and immediately fell asleep. I got up, took a quick shower, and thought about recent events. It's a shame she was such an unfaithful wife. The last few weeks have been the best sex of my life. On Thursday morning, I woke up and started getting ready for work. I looked at Dorothy. She was still lying naked in the same position as yesterday. I felt a little sad, knowing that this was the last time I would see her like this. Although we didn't have much love in our marriage, we still had good times. I knew that when I returned home in the evening, a letter from her asking for a divorce would be waiting for me. I took my things and went to work. I needed to go home to pick up a few tools. Her car was gone, and I was glad about that. I didn't want to run into her right now. When I entered the house, I did not see any letter. I decided to check my answering machine to see if there were any new messages. She received a call from Dixie asking if she was ready to go. They were supposed to pick her up around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The trip would take less than 4 hours. I looked at my watch, it was already noon, and then I heard Dorothy's voice. "Dixie, am I sure I'm making the right decision? I'm starting to have doubts." Dorothy said, "What do you mean? You waited 32 years to be with Paul." "What happened?" Dixie asked. "George seems to have changed in the last few weeks." "I still have feelings for him, although it's not love," Dorothy replied. "You slept with him again, right?" Dixie reproached her. "It was your sex that caused everything with Paul. I told you not to have sex with George before you left him." "I knew it would complicate things," Dixie added. "Why don't you call Paul? This might help you figure it out." "You're right, Dixie. As soon as I am back in the meeting with Paul, everything will fall into place," Dorothy replied. "I'll go to the phone booth and call Paul to calm down. I don't want a call from here so as not to leave traces of the call. Apparently she is now on the street calling her lover. Well, I'll meet him on Saturday with my surprises." I left her a note in which I wrote that it was a pity that I didn't find her at home, and suggested that we have lunch together. Before she went to the meeting, I even signed it, "Love, George," to give it a little kick. None of this was true, but she didn't know that. When I returned home from work that evening, Her letter was waiting for me on the table. Apparently, a conversation with Paul convinced her to go. I opened the letter, and the only thing that had changed was the handwritten note at the bottom. I will never forget the last 2 weeks. Love, Dorothy. On Saturday, I went to the Ramada Hotel. I booked a room for myself as well as rooms for my sons and their families. I also notified the reunion committee that we were coming to surprise Dorothy on our 33rd anniversary, but asked that we not tell her about it. I wanted to make sure we had dinner reservations. We all gathered in my room so I could explain the bad news to them. I started by saying that I had hoped to have a surprise for their mother and I's anniversary, but circumstances had changed. Their mother is in love with another man and has been with him all these years. She waited until they grew up to leave me. Everyone was stunned and said, "What could be expected in such a situation? No, Dad, it's a mistake. Dad, this can't be true. Are you sure?" "I'm so sorry, Dad. I can't believe Mommy did this to you." And many more words. Finally, I said, "Stop." She left me this letter before she left for the meeting. She didn't want you to see it, but I have to show it to you. And then I have another document for you. They all read the letter, and they had tears in their eyes, especially when they got to the part that said, "I was not their father." After they finished reading, Dot looked at me and said, "You will always be my father. Always." Then she hugged me. I said, "I have good news for all of you. At the very least, I hope you will perceive them as good." And I handed them a letter with the DNA results confirming that I was their biological father. Everyone started crying and hugging me, saying I knew it was true. I just knew it. I looked at my children and their spouses and said, "Although you may be hurt by what your mother did, please understand that she loved you. She didn't love me. You can hate what she did, but don't hate her. She was a wonderful mother to each of you and lived just like me for your sake. She put her life on hold so you could have both a mother and a father. Don't blame her for this." Everyone looked sad but thought about my words. We all headed to the restaurant, my 2 sons with their wives and children, and Dot holding my arm. There were at least 100 people in the room when we entered. I told the doorman my name and how many of us were in the company. We were shown to a table with a reserved sign. We all sat down and Dot noticed that I had 1 extra seat. I said that I was expecting a guest. We all looked around and noticed Dottie and Joe. Sitting opposite them were Dorothy and Paul. They all seemed to be having a great time when Dixie suddenly noticed us and exclaimed to the entire room, "Oh my God, your family is here." Dorothy's jaw dropped in complete shock. "Oh my God, what are they doing here?" We heard her words. Dot then stood up and walked over to her mother's desk. She looked at her and said, "I hate what you did to Dad, but I will try to understand because I love you. You are my mother. Dad is here to give a speech. You will still hear, but the results will be completely different." With these words, she returned to our table. Sitting down, she said, "Sorry, Dad, but I had to say it." I simply smiled at her and greeted our guest who had just arrived. "George Mike Dot, let me introduce you to June Simon, Paul's ex-wife." Everyone greeted her and her sons introduced their wives and children. June turned out to be a nice woman. She was about 5 inches and probably weighed about 145 pounds. She was dressed very elegantly. When Paul noticed her at our table, he stood up to approach us, but Dorothy stopped him. She knew it would be a big mistake on his part. A podium was set up on the stage for speeches. The presenter stood up and began to speak the standard words, then announced the names of all graduates present, asking them to stand. When Dixie's name was called, we clapped lightly. Then they called Joe, and we clapped again. When they named Dorothy, we made a lot of noise to get that attention. We saw that she was ashamed. When Paul's name was announced, we didn't clap at all. Then they called June, and we cheered loudly again, which made her laugh. After a few speeches, the host invited me, George Manning, onto the stage for a special appearance. Everyone at our table clapped and cheered as I walked to the podium. I began my speech by thanking the committee for giving me the opportunity to speak. I said that I asked to speak to congratulate my wife Dorothy, whom I pointed to on our 33rd wedding anniversary, which would be in 2 days. The audience applauded us. I raised my hands to calm everyone down and continued. Before I left today, Dorothy left me a farewell letter, and I want to read excerpts from it to you. She was in love with Paul Simon throughout our years of marriage. I assume many of you already knew about this. I looked around the room and then said, "Today she's leaving me for him." "So I am serving you, Dorothy, with the divorce papers." "Please let the officer in," I asked. The sheriff's deputy walked over and handed Dorothy the divorce papers. He then handed Paul the papers for adultery. "My lawyer has also drafted a divorce agreement, which you can read later," I added. "And one last thing," I continued. "In her letter, Dorothy states that Paul is the biological father of my 3 children." I looked at Paul, who was grinning stupidly back. "This is not true," I stated firmly. Dot stood up and walked over to her mother, handing her copies of the DNA results on the children and me, as well as a notarized copy from the doctor confirming that I was their biological father. Paul had an angry expression on his face instead of a grin, and Dorothy burst into tears. Then June stood up and said, "Paul, I only have one thing I want to tell you. While you cheated on me, I also took revenge. Our 2 children are not yours. Their father is your brother, John." And she handed him the DNA test. "Your brother John and I are getting married next month." With these words, June and I left the reception. The children wanted to stay and talk to their mother. I was glad about this. She really was a good mother to them. The next morning, we all met for breakfast before heading home. The children seemed more relaxed. They said that after I left, their mother came to their table to talk to them privately. They didn't tell me what they were talking about, but they said they had invited Dorothy to breakfast. But without Paul, I turned around and saw Dorothy there. "Dad, can Mom join us for breakfast?" they asked. I replied, "She will always be a welcome guest at our family events, as long as she doesn't bring Paul with her." Dorothy sat with us and ate. She looked at me with sadness in her eyes and asked, "George, how long have you known all this?" I looked at her and said, "Does it matter?" I stood up, hugged everyone in the family goodbye, and looked at Dorothy, who was crying. I said, "You made your choice, now you have to live with it." After that, I went home. There are no easy answers to issues such as infidelity, adultery, and divorce. Life goes on, and we need to live it day by day. I know that many readers may think that I should have been tougher on Dorothy. I think that everyone resolves such issues in their own way. I'm happy with how I did it. Dorothy says after George's speech at the homecoming, "I felt completely humiliated. The worst part was that I deserved it. Paul, the so-called love of my life, was no protection for me." My friends Dixie and Joe just sat there stunned by what was happening. I sat at the same table with them, but essentially I was alone. I made the biggest mistake of your life. I lost my husband by choice, became estranged from my children whom I truly loved, and may have lost the opportunity to be a part of my grandchildren's lives. After George and June left the reception, I walked over to my children. I listened to them tell me how much I had ruined everything. They reprimanded me thoroughly. We also remembered all the good times we experienced with and without George. They reminded me that family is the most important thing, even if it is broken. They still wanted me to be a part of their life, but couldn't imagine how that would be possible if I moved to another state. They wanted their children to know their grandmother, and it brought tears to my eyes. I told them all how much I love them and always have, without doubting anything. Looking back, I was glad that George was their biological superior's Sky Father. He was a good father to them, and he will make an amazing grandfather. I told them that I needed to think a lot and seriously. I'll be home on Monday, but now I didn't know where I would stop. I planned to move in with Paul only after the end of the school term, which was a few months away. There was no doubt that George would not allow me to stay in the house. I guess I should have thought about this earlier. George Jr. asked me to come and stay with him and his family until I decided what to do. They had a spare room in the basement where I could retire. I just started crying because of all the crap I put my family through, and they still loved me. George Jr. looked at me and said, "We don't like what you did, Mom, or the way you did it. But as Dad pointed out, you are our mother, and you always put us first. We need to learn to live with it. We all love you, but not your actions." I looked at George Jr. and said, "Your father said that after what I did to him," and I started crying again. God, what have I done with my life? I kissed all my children and told them how much I loved them and how much I wanted to see them before they went home. They said they were going to have breakfast with their dad in the morning and that I could join them. But they said, "Please, Mom, don't bring your boyfriend." I told them I'll see if I can do it. I then returned to the table with Dixie, Joe, and Paul. I asked Paul if we could leave the meeting. It was enough for me for one evening. Dixie and Joe decided to leave too. The crowd was looking at us all too much. I knew we were the topic of everyone's conversation. Paul and I went up to the room. As soon as we arrived, Paul wanted to make love. In fact, all he wanted was sex. I pulled away, telling him that what I needed now was love and compassion. I needed to be held. I needed to be comforted, not have sex. I looked at Paul and asked him why he didn't come up to my kids and introduce himself. He said that he was very embarrassed when he found out that they were not his. I looked at him and said, "You always told me that you wanted to be part of the family, that we are going to do everything we can to become one family. Do you still think that way, Paul?" He looked at me and said, "I don't know. I like being with you, but I want you, not your children and their children. I have no connection with them. I thought we would move away from all this and be together. Paul, what about our families? I want to see my children and grandchildren. I want to be a part of their life. I know we never talked much about family, but I love mine and want a relationship with them." Paul's answer shocked me. He said, "Dorothy, why don't we just make love tonight and talk about it all tomorrow?" I told him I didn't think so, that I needed to go out and collect my thoughts. I opened the door and went out. I had nowhere to go, so I went back to the living room and sat in a booth to think. I ordered a drink. When two of my former classmates, Barb and Sue, asked if they could join me, I just said, "Of course I'll enjoy their company." Both Barb and Sue were divorced. They were a little wild, but over the years, they have become very domesticated. I think after you turn 50, your thoughts will start to change. We were good friends during our school days, but that was many years ago. We never really talked after I moved to Ohio. They both looked at me and said, "Dorothy, we need to talk to you. It's about Paul." "Flor? What about Paul?" I asked. They then started telling me they didn't want to interfere in my personal life. But after my husband's speech, they realized there was something I needed to know. Paul dated both of them over the years. He said he was in an unhappy marriage and was going to get a divorce eventually. We both knew that all Paul wanted was good sex. Sorry for our language, but we were both divorced, so that was all we needed, Barb said. "We knew you slept with Paul at parties, but we thought you just left after some strange event at the party. We had no idea you were in love with Paul. Otherwise, we would have talked to you years ago. We liked you, we always have, but if you marry Paul, it won't last long. He had sexual relations with most of the divorced women in our class, as well as some married ones." Barb continued, "I have no idea what kind of man your husband is, but your family is what every woman wants when she reaches our age. Children, grandchildren, this is the essence of life. Do what you want with Paul, but not for his sake. I won't lose touch with such a wonderful family like yours. Paul didn't get divorced to marry you. His wife June finally caught him cheating on film and got the evidence she needed to get a divorce. She left Paul with almost nothing. You'll support him if you two get together." My mind was wandering in a dozen different directions. I didn't know what to think, but for some reason one question came to mind. I looked at Barb and Sue and thanked them for telling me all this before making an even bigger fool of myself. I asked them if they could answer one question for me, and please be honest. This was very important, they said. "Of course, we will tell you the truth. We have no reason to lie to you. What do you need to know, Dorothy?" "Is this one of the married women Paul slept with Dixie?" I asked. "Yeah, but we thought you knew, since you two were best friends. In fact, there are rumors that you and Paul have switched places with Dixie and Joe." "What? No, that's not true. I never had sex with Joe, who started such false, hateful rumors about me," I asked. "Well, Dorothy, you better take a long sip of this drink before I tell you." "You'll need it," Sue replied. Barb continued, "We were sitting around the table at a meeting with Bob and Harry. When Bob looked at you, he said, 'If I knew she played these games, too, I would try to get into her pants.' And Harry said, I was talking to Joe, and he said he was in her pants just a couple of weeks ago. Sue added. Barb then replied, Nonsense, Harry. Dorothy wouldn't sleep with Joe. But Harry said, Joe said he could prove it. Dorothy has a small brown mole on the right side. And he added, We would like to see this. Barb grinned, but her gaze remained serious. I panicked and started crying. Barb and Sue tried to console me. They said, We know Joe is lying. Everything will be all right. I looked at them both and said, But I do have a mole. How could Joe know this? I asked them to spend the night with them if possible. I didn't want to go back to Paul that night, and certainly not to Dixie and Joe until I got answers. Sue went to Paul's room to pick up my things. She said Paul was angry but still gave her my things. I called my son Mike at his room and asked if I could go home with him the next day. He simply said, Of course, Mom, we will be glad to take you with us. And then he added, I love you. Mom, I replied, and I love you, Mikey. Barb, Sue, and I went back to their room where we talked some more. I was exhausted after everything that had happened that evening. The girls left me in one of the beds, and after drinking one or two more drinks, I quickly fell asleep. The next morning, I went to a family breakfast. It was nice just being around my family. I could see that George wanted to make some snarky remarks about me, but he held back because all the kids were with us. Damn it, I lived 32 years with this man and never really got to know him, and he met me. When George said goodbye to us before going home, he wished me luck in my new life. I couldn't hold back my tears. Even though I never loved him, we lived together for 33 years. Tomorrow would have been our anniversary. After breakfast, I returned to Barb and Sue's room to pack my things and head home. I thanked them for letting me spend the night with them and for telling the truth about Paul. This will help me make important decisions in the future. Then I went to Paul's room. When he opened the door, he was still in his underwear. He was clearly unhappy. Paul said he came to the meeting to spend time with me, and I ruined everything. He didn't mention anything that happened at the meeting at all. I told him that I had to leave, that I would go home with my son Mike and his family, and that I would contact him later to talk. I walked up to him to kiss him goodbye, and as we kissed, he squeezed my butt. And then he said, Here's a souvenir for you until our next meeting. Paul asked me why I wasn't going home with Joe and Dixie. I just looked at him and replied, I started having doubts about my friendship with Dixie after I found out that you had sex with her. Paul's eyes widened, but he didn't deny it. He simply said, That was several years ago and it was a mistake. I need you, Dorothy. The words several years ago meant that he slept with Dixie more than once. I didn't say anything in response. I just said goodbye and went to Mike's room. I asked Mike if I could use his phone to call Joe and Dixie and tell them I was going home with... When Dixie answered the phone, I told her I was going home with my son Mike, but would talk to her in the next few days. She was a little taken aback by my tone, but replied, Okay, we'll talk later. When I got home, I called George to make arrangements to pick up my personal belongings. I told him that I thought the 65%/35% asset split was too strict, considering we were saving everything together. But I was willing to do it so we could move forward. George said I could come over with George Jr. to pick up whatever I needed. If I agree to the terms of the divorce, then I should contact Sally Hawk, his lawyer, and she will handle the paperwork. He added that he now wants to have as little contact with me as possible and will not be at home when George Jr. and I arrive. I'm a teacher, and I had to go to work on Monday, so I contacted a realtor to find an apartment without inconveniencing George Jr. family any longer than necessary. I found an apartment close to the school, a short drive from my son's houses. I could move in there within a few weeks. I contacted Sally Hawk and the divorce process began. She turned out to be a very smart lawyer and said that everything would be completed within a few months, since none of us objected to the conditions. I also asked her to contact George and ask if I could buy back some of our furniture, bedding, and other household items for 2/3 of their value to furnish my apartment. Sally must have contacted George because 3 days later, he called me personally and asked what it was about. He thought I was going to move to Michigan as soon as the divorce was finalized. I told him that if he agreed to meet me face to face, I would explain everything. It's too difficult to discuss over the phone. George agreed to come to George Jr.'s house to listen to what I had to say, but reminded me that the divorce was going to happen, and he wanted me to understand that. I assured him that I was fully aware of this and had no intention of setting any traps. I just thought it was time to tell him everything. George Jr. and his family were going to visit his in-laws for a few hours, and we would have some time to talk privately. George arrived, and we sat down in the living room. He's on the couch, I'm in the chair. I offered him a beer, which he of course accepted, and I took some iced tea. I asked George not to give me too many shots because I really wanted to tell him everything. He agreed to try to keep it, but made no promises. I just started by telling him I would never see Paul again. I made a huge mistake, and now I'm paying for it. I'm the only one to blame for this. All these years I thought I loved Paul, ever since I found out at my first high school reunion that he wanted me. But all he really wanted was the great sex we had. It was the same with me. We were drawn to illicit relationships, infidelity, and the feeling that we could escape without consequences. We both looked forward to these meetings because they gave us freedom, as if we didn't care about anything but each other. I realized after your speech that I never really knew Paul. I thought I knew, but all I knew was how good this carefree sex was. No worries, no problems, just so-called love and sex, 2 or 3 days every few years. We had nothing in common anymore. I thought it was... But when I mentioned family, I realized that he wanted nothing to do with it. He simply agreed with everything that was dear to me in order to get what I wanted, that same carefree sex. I went into this relationship thinking like a teenager in love. I never matured in my relationship with Paul. It was as if I was wearing blinders, not wanting to find out the truth. If we really loved each other, we would have divorced and gotten married years ago. But it didn't happen. And the only reason I believed it was happening now was because Paul got divorced last year. At the meeting, I learned that it was June who filed for divorce, not Paul. George interrupted me and said, "Why are you telling me all this now? It won't change anything. The way I dumped all this on you was wrong. Completely wrong. While we may not have had the most loving marriage, you deserved more. Much more. I should have talked to you in person like we're doing now. I know it won't change anything, but I want to go to my grandkids and family events. I know you want it too. I want us to at least be polite to each other as a family." I got up and brought George another beer. As I handed it to him, I thought about our marriage. "George, I must apologize for what I said about children's DNA. God, you didn't deserve this. I don't expect you to ever forgive me for these remarks, but I am truly sorry. Now, looking back, I'm really glad that you are their father. You have always been so kind to them, and they have so many of your good qualities." George looked at me and listened carefully to every word. I could never read his mind, but at least he let me say it all. "I have a couple more things I want to say, George. I remember our 33 years together. I can't say that there was love, but I can't say that it didn't exist. We've been married, we've had sex, we've had a family. As for our family, there was definitely love between us. Our children knew this, and now they have passed it on to their families. We brought them up well. Maybe we really had love for each other, but over time, we just didn't try to preserve it as much as we should have." I teared up a little. Maybe if we showed our feelings to each other the way we showed our children, things would have turned out differently. I know it's too late for us, but after the way you treated me for the last month, I started to feel like writing that letter was a mistake. Honestly, I thought I was starting to fall in love with you again. I started crying and said, "Isn't this nonsense?" Then I wiped my tears. George looked at me and said, "At any time before you left for your meeting on Thursday, you could have stopped the letter. Why didn't you do this?" "Well, George," I replied, "deep down, I believed I was going to throw it away, but I called Dixie, and she tried to talk me out of it. She suggested that I call Paul and talk to. If I had been home and had lunch with you as planned, I might have stopped. But as fate would have it, I called Paul and wasn't here when you came home for lunch." George asked, "What about your friends Dixie and Joe? Have you told them about your latest plans?" No, George, I didn't talk to them about my future plans. I'm not sure if I even want to remain friends with them. I found out at the meeting that Paul slept with Dixie. He confessed to me, and I believe this happened more than once. If I had known about this sooner, I would have dropped Paul like a hot potato years ago. I find it hard to believe that Dixie would do this if she were a real friend. Joe told people at the meeting that he slept with me 2 weeks ago. I couldn't believe he would lie about me like that. The only problem was that he knew I had a mole. I have no idea how could have known this unless Dixie told him. George, did he see us having sex at the motel a couple of weeks ago? I'm not going to discuss your friends with you, Dorothy. If you need information about them, ask them. These are your friends, not mine. But just so you know, I know several men who slept with your friend Dixie. I never told you because I thought you probably figured it out yourself. She apparently doesn't know you're still here. She called me on Monday when they returned from a meeting. She wanted to know if she could come to me. I simply told her that she was part of the reason my marriage was failing, and I had no desire to be friends with her. Then George told me he was selling the house and most of the furniture. The money will be divided according to agreement. Since I'm staying in the city, I can pick up any furniture I need for my apartment. He said it would be worth taking God's things too, since she would need a place to stay when she wasn't at college. He suggested that she would prefer to live with me so that we could have more time for girl talk. Naturally, he won't take money from me for furniture. Before I left, I thanked him for listening to me. Then I looked at him and said, George, maybe our marriage was more typical of modern marriages. Maybe he wasn't so bad after all. We lasted 33 years and still experienced good moments together. The next day I called Dixie. She said she was very glad I called her. She was wondering when I was going to move in with Paul. She then asked what happened after the meeting and at home. I immediately started saying what a vile person she turned out to be. I'm not moving to Michigan to be with Paul. My whole life with Paul was a farce. I destroyed my marriage, nearly alienated my family, and allowed my so-called best friends to make a complete fool of me. What are you saying, Dorothy? Dixie asked. Dixie, have you ever slept with Paul? I asked. Who told you that, George? She asked. No, I replied. Actually, Paul said it. Does he have a reason to lie? Sorry, Dorothy. It was a long time ago. I didn't mean to upset you. How long ago was it? I asked Dixie. Oh, God, she replied. It's been a long time. I don't even remember. Try to remember, Dixie, I said. Oh, for God's sake. 10, maybe 15 years ago, she said. What about 3 years ago, when we went to your parents' house and I got sick and went to bed early? I guess you forgot then, but Paul didn't forget. What about George? Have you ever had sex with him? I asked. If George told you he had sex with me at the motel when we went there, he's lying. George didn't tell me anything, except that you called him the other day. Did you want to sleep with him again, Dixie? I continued. When I asked George what happened at the motel, he simply said, ask Dixie. So if George had sex with you in a motel, and then you let your husband Joe have sex with me while I was unconscious, then you both deserve to be tried, bitch. Dixie replied, it's all George's fault. He started all this sex. He let Joe sleep with you, and then he slept with me, and he knew about your upcoming divorce. What? I cut her off. You damn prostitute. You had sex with my boyfriend, had sex with my husband. Let that bastard, your husband, take advantage of me. And then George told you that he knew about my letter, and you didn't even say a word to me about all this. I know George well, enough to know that he did this all for revenge. But you were my best friend. I never want to see you or your husband again. As for Paul, you can go to his place and have sex with him while your pathetic husband watches. Then I hung up. Our divorce was finalized 6 months ago. My life is pretty sad now. I spent a lot of time in the bar, probably just because I wanted company. Someone to talk to. It was then that I began to realize that Dorothy and I had truly lived a life together. Maybe not the best, but not the worst either. But we were life partners. Now I come home to an empty apartment every evening. I sit there and either go online or watch TV. It was okay for the first few months, but now it's getting very boring. Here I am in my 50s, sitting at home alone. I tried dating several women, but they, like me, seemed lonely. With most of them, it came down to sex. I guess I was still a womanizer. I didn't want any commitment. I didn't want to get married again. And that's what most of these women seem to want, someone to share their lives with and who could take care of them. I stayed away from married women. I guess after what happened to me, I didn't want to be responsible for ruining another marriage, even if the woman was just looking for sex. I started spending more time at my welding job. The money was good, but money was not my problem. I missed my bitch wife, Dorothy. I don't know how to explain it. This woman has been cheating on me for over 28 years. We lived almost separate lives. She minded her own business. I did mine. But there were so many moments when I remembered the times we spent together. Our family vacations. We always had a good time together. We went to our children's games. We were together, laughing and supporting them. The only thing that brought me joy now was meeting my children and grandchildren. And then I began to realize that every time I visited them, Dorothy was there. We talked politely, trying not to be rude or bring up the past. Maybe it's just her presence next to me, I don't know. And then I would start thinking again, damn her for what she did to our lives. Then I began to remember all the infidelities that I committed during our marriage. God, I was far from a saint. Most of these women were just casual, one-night stands. But they were still cheating. Dorothy probably could have left me after any of them. Why didn't she do this? According to her letter of farewell, she knew about all these betrayals. I can remember at least 20 times when I was unfaithful to her. Why didn't she demand a divorce? Maybe because she thought she was no better than me with her long relationship with that idiot Paul. Damn, I'd like to know that. Maybe someday I'll ask her. I got up from the couch to make myself something to eat. Damn, how I missed Dorothy's cooking. This woman knew how to cook. She knew what I liked and how to prepare it. In fact, she knew everything about my likes and dislikes. Right down to what my favorite beer is. I think after 33 years with a person, you learn a lot about why was I so blind to her long relationship. All I knew now was that I would much rather eat one of her pork roasts with baked potatoes and carrots than this frozen pizza I was about to make. I'll have to visit the kids this weekend to get a good dinner. Maybe I'll offer to have a barbecue, and they can invite their mother to cook something delicious. I'll offer to bring beer and drinks. That's my thing. The phone rang, and it was my daughter Dot. She said she was coming home for the weekend and just wanted to talk to me and see how I was doing. I simply replied, "I'm fine, honey, but I miss your sweet smiling face." She was my little daughter, and I really missed her. She studied in Michigan and tried to come home at least once a month. When she arrived, she stayed with her mother. They talked a lot and did their feminine things, whatever that meant. After a few minutes of talking, I suggested that she call her brother Gia and tell him that she was coming over for the weekend and that we could have a barbecue. She could even invite her mother. "Dad," she replied, "you miss Mom's cooking, don't you?" "No," I said, she interrupted me. "It's okay, Dad. I miss Mom's cooking too. I'll tell her about the barbecue. I'm sure she'll come." "What do you want her to cook?" She laughed. "Why are you so sure that she will come?" I asked. "Dad, I shouldn't tell you this, but Mom said that every time you plan to come, we must definitely invite her." "I know you don't want to hear this, Dad, but I really believe that Mommy loves you. She lives in a hell that she created for herself. She completely blames herself for everything she did to you. I don't think she'll ever get over this. This actually worries me a little. Her life is school and family. I know she's not dating anyone. Many men have asked her out on a date, but she simply replies, 'No, thank you.' Mom also stopped communicating with her best friend Dixie. She hasn't told me the whole story, but I know it has something to do with her old boyfriend. And you, Dad, would you like to enlighten me?" She laughed. "Anyway, Dad, what do you want Mom to cook? How about some pork roast?" I started to speak, but Dot interrupted me again. "Dad, this is a barbecue, no barbecue pork roast." "Okay," I said, "how about Mom's chicken wings with her signature sauce and potato casserole? I'll buy the chicken, Grr will grill it, and Mom will make the sauce and casserole." Dot laughed. "Okay, Dad, I'll see what I can do." She paused for a moment and then added, "Daddy, I love you." "I love you too, honey," I replied. "See you on Sunday." I then hung up. The frozen pizza was ready. It was time for dinner. When I started eating pizza, A feeling of loneliness overtook me. About half an hour later, the phone rang again. I looked at the call ID and it was Junior. "Hey, Dad, it's GR. How are you?" he asked. "Yes, I'm finishing dinner and watching TV." "What's new?" I asked. "We're having a barbecue at noon on Sunday, and I was wondering if you'd like to join." "What will you have?" I asked. "Barbecue chicken and potato casserole, as if you didn't know." He laughed. My children were smart. It was probably Dorothy. "I'll be there at noon," I replied. "Dad, you buy beer and drinks and we'll take care of the chicken." "Buy more chips and sauce?" he asked. "I will," I replied, adding, "Thanks, Junior." "Anytime." "Dad, anytime," he replied, then hung up. God, even my children knew how I felt, how I loved them. Sunday came and I headed to GR's house. I remembered to buy beer, drinks, chips, and dip, as requested. When I entered, everyone greeted me. I hugged them all, kissed my grandchildren and my 2 daughters-in-law. Dot came up to me, kissed me on the cheek, and whispered, "Don't worry, Daddy, she's here." I just looked at Dot, wondering how she knew what I was thinking. Then I looked up and saw Dorothy, dressed in a beautiful yellow summer dress, applying her special barbecue sauce to the chicken. I walked up to Dorothy and said, "Hi, Dorothy, nice to see you again. The chicken smells great." Dorothy smiled at me and said, "Thank you, George. I prepared it the way you like it." "How are you doing at school?" I asked, trying to start a casual conversation. The kids get on my nerves sometimes, but otherwise, everything is fine. She then said she needed to go check on the potato casserole in the oven. My other son, Mike, came up to me and said he wanted to talk privately. We went into the living room away from everyone, and he said that Dot had spoken to him earlier and that Dorothy's former friends, Dixie and Joe, had split up. Now Joe started calling Dorothy and pestering her. "Dad, I can't let that bastard bother Mom," Mike said. "I don't know what it is exactly, but Dot said he wanted to humiliate her. I can't let this happen. Mom has already suffered enough." Damn, I loved how my kids defended their mother. There's no way I'm letting them get involved in this problem. I looked at Mike and told him, "Stay away, don't do anything stupid. You have a family to take care of. I'll handle this problem, Joe myself." We went back outside and joined the barbecue. I thanked GR for the invitation, saying it was the best barbecue chicken I'd had in a long time. "Thank Mom. She cooked it along with potatoes," he replied. I just looked at Dorothy and said, "Thank you, Dorothy. You've always been a great cook." She just looked at me and replied, "Thanks, George. Anytime." I wondered what she meant by any time. Was it a random phrase, or did she really mean any time? I returned home and began to think about what to do with Joe. Now he was interfering with my family. This shouldn't have happened. I waited until Monday and went to a bar where I knew Joe might be. I saw him on a bar stool and walked up to him. When he saw me, he was clearly nervous. I said, "Joe, I need to talk to you." Now, I was a welder with strong hands and grip. Joe, on the other hand, worked in an office and didn't even play sports. Joe looked at me and said, "I have nothing to tell you, George." "Joe," I said, "I want to talk to you. I suggest you get off this damn bar stool and come over here to the booth to talk for a minute, or I'll go outside and wait for you there. The choice is yours." Joe climbed out of his chair and sat in the booth across from me. I stared into his eyes, saying nothing for a few seconds so that he would start to get nervous. Then I said, "What the hell did I hear about you calling Dorothy?" He looked at me and said, "What do you care about? Are you divorced? She can date anyone. She is an adult and over 21 years old." I stared at him again, waiting for a pause before speaking, making him even more nervous. Then, in a very low voice, so only he could hear, he said, "Listen, bastard, I made a mistake by letting you take advantage of the situation with her as revenge. I shouldn't have done this. You are not worthy to wipe your feet on it. You call her again. You will apologize for any of your words and say that you will never, and I emphasize never, bother her again. If I find out that you called her again or badmouthed her in any way, I will personally find you and put you in a damn plastic bag. Have you made yourself clear?" He muttered, "Yes, I understand." I looked at him again and said, "I didn't hear you." He answered louder, "Yes, I understand, and I promise not to bother her again." "One more thing, bastard," I added. "Call your friend Paul and give him the same message. This is not a threat. It is a fact. Next time, if I come again, there will be no talking. Do I have to break your arm or smash your face for you to understand clearly?" "No, George, I understand." and I will pass on this message to Paul," he said. "You will call Dorothy as soon as possible. I don't want you to piss her off again." After these words, I got up and left the bar. Thursday came and I was at work. One of my employees and I were doing welding work when the explosion occurred. I woke up in a hospital room. One of my sisters-in-law, Lisa, was sitting next to me, looking at me. She screamed. He woke up, and hugged me tightly. I asked her what happened. She said, "There was an explosion on Thursday, and you've been unconscious since." "What day is it today?" I asked. "Today is Sunday," answered Lisa. "You've been in a coma since Thursday. We all took turns on duty near you, replacing each other every 4 hours. Everyone, except Dorothy." I felt sad when she said that Dorothy was not on duty with me. I don't know why, but I thought. At that moment, Dorothy entered the room with tears in her eyes. Lisa continued, "Except Dorothy, she didn't leave. She stayed here with you, sleeping in the chair. We forced her to go home to clean herself up, but she returned an hour later. She even took the day off from school to spend time here with you on Friday. All this time, Dorothy stood at the door and cried. I didn't know what to think. Then she walked over to the bed, hugged me, and said, 'Welcome back, George. We all missed you.' When she left, my whole family came into the room, hugged me, kissed me, and burst into tears. All this emotion overwhelmed me, and I started to tear up. And then Doc came over, hugged me, kissed me, and said, 'We all missed you, Daddy, and we love you.' From the way she said it, I knew she included Dorothy in her words. Then the doctor entered the room and asked everyone to leave. When my family left, Dorothy said, 'I'm not leaving. He is my husband and I will stay with him.' The doctor was surprised, but replied, 'Okay, just sit down, please.' Dorothy sat down in a chair. The doctor examined me and asked many questions. I told him that the last thing I remember was the explosion, and then that I had woken up just a few minutes ago. The doctor made notes in my chart and said that I might be discharged the next day if all the tests were normal. The only thing he emphasized was that I should not be alone. You need someone to be there for at least the next few days. He added that I needed to rest more and not move too much. The doctor said I had a concussion, but in his opinion, there was no internal bleeding. He noted that I was very lucky. God gave me a second chance at life because the explosion could have killed me. He said he would come back in the morning to check on me again and left the room. My family returned to the room, and Dorothy explained to them everything the doctor had said. They immediately began to worry about who would look after me after I was discharged because I couldn't be left alone. Dorothy looked at me, then at the children, and said, "I'm taking Daddy home with me for a few days until he gets better. He needs someone who will look after him." I called the school and took a week of personal leave. I explained the accident situation, and they gave me time without any problem. I looked at Dorothy and said, "Wait a minute, don't I have a say in this matter?" My whole family looked at me and said in one voice, "No." All I could answer was, "Okay." Dorothy went out to talk to the nurse, and I asked GR about my business and how Ben, my assistant at work, was doing. He said that Ben was fine. He was far from the explosion. It was Ben who called 911. When Mom found out you were in the hospital, she immediately contacted your office and made arrangements for the weekend. She told Ben to call her on Monday to make sure everyone had work. She just took control, Dad. She said that in 33 years with you, she had learned enough about business to organize everything. I know, Dad, Mom hurt you a lot, but she's still an amazing woman and a wonderful mom. I can't tell you what to do, but we all know that Mommy still loves you. We see this, but we will respect any decision you make. As my family was leaving, the nurses came into the room and gave me medicine. I had a severe headache and soon fell asleep. I woke up late at night and saw Dorothy still sitting in the chair and looking at me. When she saw me open my eyes, she asked, "George, are you okay?" I asked her, "Why didn't you go home with the others?" She simply replied, "Tomorrow we will go home together, George." I nodded and went back to sleep. The next morning, Jor and Mike came over to help me pack up the clothes, flowers, and cards I had received while in the hospital, while Dorothy worked on my discharge paperwork. She received all the instructions from the doctor about what to do in the next few days. My sons helped me get to Dorothy's apartment. I realized that I had never been there before. There was a lot of our old furniture inside. My favorite chair and sofa were also there. My son sat me down in a chair and lifted my legs, saying they would come by later. Dorothy came into the room and asked if I wanted something to eat. I said I wouldn't mind a sandwich and a cup of coffee. She went into the kitchen while I was resting. A few minutes later, she brought me a ham and cheese sandwich, prepared the way I like it, with Swiss cheese, tomato, and ham on toasted rye bread. She remembered my favorite sandwich. She also brought a cup of hot coffee, which was just perfect. She placed the tray of food in front of me, turned on the TV to my favorite sports channel, and left the room. Damn how I missed her. I really missed you. Just having her in the house made everything better. What the hell am I supposed to do now? I honestly didn't know. After I ate, I apparently dozed off. I remember how I began to dream, or perhaps just dream, about our last conversation with Dorothy. I remember Dorothy saying, "I think about our 33 years all the time. I can't say that there was love there, but I also can't say that there wasn't. We had a marriage, we had sex, we had a family, and in terms of our family, we both definitely loved children. They knew it. And now they themselves pass it on to their families. We did a good job raising them. Maybe we really had love for each other. But over all these long years, we just haven't worked on it the way we should have. Maybe if we showed our feelings to each other the same way we showed our children, things might have turned out differently. I know it's too late for us, but after the way you treated me for the last month, I started to feel like writing that letter was a mistake. I truly began to believe that I was falling in love with you again." She started crying and said, "Well, isn't that ironic?" Then wiped away her tears. Then I remembered the doctor's words. "You had a concussion, but as far as I know, there is no internal bleeding. You are incredibly lucky. God gave you a second chance at life. You could have easily died when you were thrown back by the blast wave." I woke up and saw that Dorothy had taken the tray and cup and was now sitting again and looking at me. "George, are you okay?" she asked. "George, I want to thank you for what you did for me." "What have I done?" I asked. Joe called and apologized for bothering me. I know you talked to him. I don't know who told you this, but it was a huge relief for me. He said he would never bother me again. And that's not all, George. Paul also called me and said almost the same thing. I don't know how you did it, but I just want to tell you. Thank you, George. While we're apologizing, I have an apology for you, Dorothy. When I was in revenge mode, I let Joe take advantage of you. Now, looking back, I understand that it was mean even for me. Offered her a room. As you know, she had to go back to college today, but she said she'll be in touch and might come home next weekend to visit you. Dorothy helped me get out of my chair and walk us to Dot's room. She brought me my medications and I went back to sleep. For the next couple of days, I was heavily medicated and spent most of my time in a chair or in bed. Every time I woke up, I knew Dorothy was there. She turned out to be an excellent nurse. My sons visited me to check how I was doing. I told them I was getting better. The next day, we had to go to the doctor to see how my recovery was going. Dorothy looked after my business and made sure the work continued. This woman did everything for me. Why have I never noticed this? It seems that for some people, you have to go through a divorce and almost die to realize everything. The next day, we went to the doctor and he said everything looked fine. In his opinion, I will be able to return to work next Monday. Dorothy was very happy and said it was great news, but she knew it was time for me to return to my own home. She took me home and came in with me. The house seemed gloomy and dark compared to her apartment. It's probably just the influence of a woman's hand. The brightest thing in my house at that moment was Dorothy herself, standing in front of me. I looked at her and wondered at what point and where everything went wrong. I asked her if I could come see her the next day to talk. She looked at me and said, "Anytime, George, it will be fine. Do you want me to cook dinner?" I can prepare something for you when you come." I looked at her and said, "That would be very nice of her." She looked at me and said, "Roast pork, baked potatoes, and carrots." I just smiled. She knew my favorite dish. The next day, I went to her house for dinner. She prepared my favorite dish. After that, we talked for a long time. I told her that I would like to start dating her again, but we need to go slow. We both lived in different houses. I started visiting her at least 5 times a week. I think we started to fall in love with each other again. We no longer took each other for granted and tried not to dwell on the past. We didn't talk about remarriage, but to all our friends, we were a couple again. Our children and grandchildren were always happy to see us together. Returning to my apartment didn't seem so hard anymore, because I knew that tomorrow I would see Dorothy again. The first time we made love again, I thought it would be awkward, but it wasn't. We reconnected as a couple and put each other first. We literally made love. I didn't go to bars anymore. I didn't need it. I had a loving friend whom I could come to at any time when I had a desire, and this began to happen more and more often. Will we get married again? We don't know. Now we just meet and enjoy every day. As the doctor said, God gave me a second chance at life. It was the least I could do for Dorothy. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one. Click to the next one, click to the next, click to the next one, click to the next one, click to the next.